Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me for the final installment of our community science series with the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. I'm going to start sharing my screen. There we go. Great. So thank you for joining us tonight for the final installment of our 2022 community science series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about documenting non-native invasive species on Nantucket. The various ways we do it, primarily using the EdMaps distributional database. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Sarah Boyce. I am the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. And since we are recording this, if you're watching this later and have any questions, my contact information is at the end, and I'm happy to answer questions about invasive species on Nantucket, about EdMaps and invasive species mapping. So just before we get into invasive species, I wanted to talk about the community science series. So community science, a lot of people say citizen science or public participation in scientific research. But basically community science as we see it is a way for people to learn about science and the world through meaningful participation in research. And there's lots of different types of participation. I, of course, here have my son through all his different age stages as I make him participate in science. But there's collecting data, there's using publicly collected data, there's making observations, there's helping to summarize and analyze data. There's lots of different ways that people participate in science at their comfort level. And if you're interested in community science generally and you stumbled into the invasive plant mapping one, as I said, this is the last of our community science series for the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. We've done programs on eBird, phenology with Nature's Notebook, precipitation collection with CocoRa's. We did an iNaturalist community science workshop, and this is our invasive species or EdMaps program. If you'd like to see any of these other programs, they're available. The recordings are available at llnf.org, and you can click over. This is a picture of our webpage where it's resources, and under resources, there's a previous program recordings. It has some other talks we've done, but it has the virtual programs such as the tracking phenology with Nature's Notebook. So I encourage you to check those out. So before we get started into how we document invasive plants, I just kind of want everyone to be on the same page about what is an invasive plant. So the first step of being an invasive plant is being not native to the region. And so a species is considered, first of all, it's not indigenous to the area. So for Nantucket, because we have a moat around us of the ocean, we have a distinct species list of what's been here for a long time. And then it's also unlikely to have arrived without human assistance. So there is natural speciation, things blowing over, and there's some debate about whether or not that's considered a non-native species, and that's a completely different argument. But basically what we're talking about is species that have have transported to a new area with human assistance. And then what makes something invasive, that once it's established, it's a non-native species that is spreading that has negative impacts. So there's many species that are new to a landscape that don't have invasive tendencies. They're considered established. But to have invasive tendencies, it causes some kind of economic, human health, or ecological harm. And so some of our invasive plants might be things that you're very familiar with. Maybe you're familiar with invasive plants in general, but you might just be familiar with what these species look like and not really realizing that many of us in the field of conservation and science consider them invasive. So our Rosa rugosa, for example, non-native Phragmites, so that tall reed in the marshes, black swallowwort, which is that black flower, brown and spotted knapweed, the lower right purple picture, the red one, euonymus, which is the brightly colored red shrub in the fall, and purple loosestrife are just a few of the beautiful examples of our non-native invasive plants that can be found around Nantucket. For New England, now these data are a little bit old, but this is still the kind of, I think they're generally still true. For New England, 32% of documented plants in the flora for New England are not native, and 10% of those are considered invasive and directly threaten native species. I think I haven't delved into the data again recently, but I think these numbers are a little bit higher. We've seen, with climate change and increased transport of goods and travel, an increase in the non-native species. So these might actually be bumped up and be a little higher now. And an example is multiflora rose. It's native to Japan, introduced in 1886 for erosion control, like many things. And it was promoted as a bird-friendly plant well into the mid to late 1900s. And so this is just one example of how a species that came to be and established in our region and is now a quite invasive plant. And so what is the harm? So I mentioned earlier that an invasive species causes some kind of economic, human health, or ecological harm, or sometimes all three. So examples are, economic harm. Removing these species costs tens of billions of dollars per year annually in our country. They can also cause economic harm by destroying rangeland fields, for example, and affecting the economies that way. Human health, there are certain species that are directly poisonous to people, but the other types of human health are like there's research that has shown that tick densities are 3 times higher under non-native invasive shrub populations. And that's because in the Northeast, especially, non-native invasive shrubs like honeysuckle and euonymus and Japanese barberry that invade understory forests have a higher humidity content under their leaves, and they hold their leaves on later into the season than the native species. The ticks like those areas, and so increasing tick densities in invasive species habitats. And then ecological is a thing that I'm primarily concerned about as a land manager in a conservation land, and as a researcher and scientist of rare species, is that invasives can often crowd out natives. They can be harmful to native insects, birds, and wildlife. They can take pollinators away from native species. There's lots of many different effects depending on the species we're talking about. And how do they get here? So these are just a few photos to show some of the methods of transport. So many times they're accidental. So we see hitchhikers on people's shoes. Birds love to eat invasive berries and then poop them out wherever they please. I have this picture of a tractor, not to point fingers to this individual person, but a lot of management that we do can help spread invasive species. Transport of firewood transports a lot of invasive pest and insect species. Boats are another one. We don't get into that as much on Nantucket, but freshwater aquatic invasives can be spread from waterway to waterway with boat transport. And then, of course, on the bottom right, we have the nursery industry, which does contribute widely to non-native invasive plantings. And what are we doing about it? So here on Nantucket, we have the Invasive Plant Species Committee, and it's made up of a group of individuals, mostly conservation professionals who are interested in this issue of non-native species. We work together on a number of different pulling events and projects around non-native invasive species, and primarily educational tools. So the Nantucket IPSC, the Invasive Plant Species Committee, is a subcommittee of the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative. And all these logos that are down here are different organizations that are part of the NBI. And so what, as I said, one of the things that we're doing is through the Nantucket Invasive Plant Species Committee. But in Massachusetts, there's the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, which has a criteria for listing invasive species. So why is it important to list an invasive species? So once a species makes that list, and then other state agencies adopt that list, then it's not available to be transported, sold, or purchased, sold, or transported across state boundaries. So basically, it bans the plant from being further planted or imported into the state. And then for species that aren't economically viable, it can often, being on the list helps with prioritizing management. Sometimes it helps for grants to remove and remediate for species invasions. So it's important for us as land managers to get a species that's causing a problem onto the Massachusetts invasive plant list. So they have a specific criteria. It has to be not native to Massachusetts. It has to be invading minimally managed habitats. So a lot of our conservation lands fall into that category. It has to have the potential for spreading, and it has to have evidence that it can exist in high numbers. So there's lots of different points of data that we need for each species. But how do we get these data? So they don't just magically appear. You can't say, I'm interested in getting something on the list, and then there's just magically you can do this checklist. We need the data to show evidence for this criteria. And the primary way that we collect evidence, and this is where we're getting to the point of our talk tonight, is through the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, or EDDMAPS. And EDDMAPS is the invasive species database that our state primarily looks at for invasive species documentation. So it wouldn't be enough for me to say we have a whole bunch of, let's say, Japanese knotweed on Nantucket. There has to be data points and proof that there's a whole bunch of Japanese knotweed on Nantucket. There's other databases that other states use, but most of the states in the country, in the US, have adopted EDDMAPS as the primary database. So first, I'll give you a little bit of background onto EDDMAPS and what they do and where they come from, and then we'll go over how we collect the data. And then we'll talk about how the data are used and what we can gather from that information. So as I said, EDDMAPS stands for the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. Invasive species mapping made easy. So it's real-time tracking of invasive species and pest occurrences. So I think primarily of plants. That's my area of science and the area of research. But EDDMAPS actually also covers pest species like insects, some diseases, and then it also takes into account mammals, or not just mammals, animals. So for example, the pythons in Florida and invasive boars in Oregon, and there's a lot of other animals that we don't have to deal with, knock on wood, here in Nantucket, but it's more than plants. It's local and national distribution. We put data in, we also get a lot out. And then it's a library of identification and management information. So like a lot of, if you've watched some of the other programs we've done before, a lot of the community science programs rely on volunteers and community members to contribute data, but then they also provide that data back to the community, as well as education resources, and in this case, also management information. So this program, EDDMAPS, was launched in 2005 by the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health at the University of Georgia. And what I kind of find amazing about this program was, at the time, there was a New England invasive plant program called IPAIN, which I was a part of, the Invasive Plant Atlas for New England, that was really trying to do a lot of what EDDMAPS is now doing. But it was so early on in computers, and nobody had really had cell phones then and things, that EDDMAPS was actually one of the first, because their goal wasn't originally to be a national database. It was to solve a problem around the University of Georgia. And then because they were so good at developing the database, that other areas wanted to adopt the database. And so it kind of grew organically to be national. And so it's been a really interesting process to see EDDMAPS grow to where it is today. So EDDMAPS is a web-based mapping system for documenting invasive species and pests, as I mentioned. As of May of 2022, so just this month, EDDMAPS has over 6.7 million records. And so not only is that a lot of invasive species, so we can be kind of look at that as a sad thing, we can look at it as a real positive for research. So the more data we have in large numbers, the more research people can do at different spatial scales. And the primary goal, one of the primary goals of EdMaps is early detection and rapid response. So with invasive species, one of the things that is a big goal is to find a species when it first occurs in an area or an early occurrence, so that a rapid response or rapid management action can take place. So rather than waiting for something to be truly a problem, that something like EdMaps can, alert people that there's a species present, and then management can take place. And then I pulled this directly from the website for EdMaps. As I've already stated, it's a national network, but it's shared. All the data and the resources are shared with educators, land managers, conservation biologists, and researchers, so that the data becomes a foundation for a better understanding of invasive species around the world. And I find that really interesting, because it's not just data that comes in and goes to researchers. There's a real inclusion of land managers specifically, and educators as well, around the invasive species issues. So now I'm going to get into how the mapping works, right? So what do we do with EdMaps? So like so many things, there is an app for that. So if you have ever delved into EdMaps as a tool before, this might look a little different. So just a little background. If you're new to this, then it's fine, but EdMaps has updated their app. So you think of how over time, they started in 2005, over time the technology has changed, our capabilities have changed, technology of our phones has changed. So now, very recently, they have a new app that is for the entire country. They used to have different apps for different regions, and now there's just one EdMaps app that everyone can use. So basically what you do, like anything, is you have the app, you have an account, you take a photo of the thing you see, you upload that record. That's at its base, that is how easy it is. And then at some point later, your record is verified by a local expert. And to me, that is the most important part. I should have highlighted this in like many, many colors. So the strength of EdMaps is the quality of the data, because no data are available to be served. Like, you can't look at it in a map or anything until that record is verified. And the records are verified by local experts. So I myself am our Nantucket County verifier. There's several of us on the island who are verifiers just for Nantucket. So every single time a record gets taken for Nantucket, we get a notification, and then we have to go in and verify them. So that's the strength of these data. I'm going to go into a little bit of an exact how-to in a second, but I also just wanted to show you some of the features available with EdMaps. If you've looked at it before but haven't in a while, a lot has changed. There's some things that are the same, but when I say it's changed, it's just it's a much more user-friendly interface. Excuse me. So there's a lot of ways to use the database on your desktop computer or laptop, like a big screen. There's lots of ways to visualize maps. We're going to look at some of that. There's ways to upload bulk data. So if you have a whole bunch of data from a property you've managed that you've never shared with anyone, there's a way to upload all that so you can make it available. There's lots of different types of queries and questions, so you can design maps that are just perfect for your needs. Once you have an account, you have a personal dashboard, so you can keep track of your own invasive species records. There's just a lot to go through. And then, of course, because there's so many educational resources, there are PowerPoints and videos and all kinds of things to help you use this tool in the best way possible for your needs. I'm only going to delve into some of them tonight, but just rest assured that there's a lot to go through. So the first step, like anything, is to download the app. So it's, Google and Apple. You can put it on an iPad, whatever you're comfortable with. There's an app that will go on your device. And then you set up an EdMaps account. I'm not going to go through setting up an account. It's very basic, kind of like anything. You just have an email address and some contact information. And then when you first open up the app, it goes through these little pages. It's like kind of informative where you can find it, you can map it, you verify it, you track it, and it helps you get started. So it's just some information in the beginning. The thing that's new that I'm really excited about is, and why this app now works for the whole country, is when you first open the app, it asks you like what field guide you want to download. So basically, what state are you collecting data in? And you can change it if you move or if you go visit another state, for example. But I just did this recently when they got the new app. And so you download your state. So I downloaded Massachusetts onto the app. And so now it's all plants, pests, insects, animals that are associated with IPANE. I'm sorry, IPANE with AdMaps are now in my app. And so the first time you sign in, you open the app on your phone, you'll sign in your login information that you've registered with. And then you can also, on the right-hand side, you see the green arrow points to this public profile. It's by default, it's public because you want your data to be public. You want people to be able to see it, but you can make it private if you like. And then I'm going to talk about how to report an observation in a minute, but if you look at the bottom section where the green bar is, there's all kinds of species information. So you can open a field guide for any of these individual things. If you're interested in all species, you can click all species, but it's kind of easier for me like to click on plants to get to the plants. And okay, so let's say you found a plant, you're interested in a plant, and you want to report it. So you go to new sightings, which is a positive survey report. And we're going to go through that step by step. So the first thing you do is go to new sighting. And this report form is to document a species that you're surveying in an area you found it. So you were walking on a path and you found some garlic mustard. And you're going to hit new sighting. And then you get to this page. Not page, I guess, a spot on your phone. And so this example is kudzu, but so you start to type the species so that it'll populate it, or you can go right to the species page. And anyway, you fill out what the species is. You take an image. You can either take an image right away. You can access your photo library if you've already taken photos. And then some things are just automatically populated. So like the date is automatically populated. The location will be populated based on where you're standing. And then you can change any of that. So for example, where the green arrow says location, there's a picture of a map, a Google map. You can click on that if you need to move the spot exactly from where you're standing. And there's a lot. It's kind of like you have to try it a few times you have to try it a few times before you really get comfortable with it, but it's really basic information. So like a lot of things, when you do these kind of databases, everything will be automatically populated because you're using your phone, right? So your phone, every photo is automatically geo-referenced. You have the date and time, you have your location information. So all that stuff will be automatic. I like to often take pictures first with my photo, like just basically on my phone, and then add them into the database, but you can take it directly too. That's kind of neither here nor there. For the location information, you can click, if you tap on the picture of the map, then you'll get the actual close-up of the map like this is showing. And you can either just accept it, or you can move it around. You can also draw a polygon. I think that'll come up in a sec. Yeah, so for a small infestation, you'd want to do a point. And then for something bigger, you'd want to do a polygon. So if you're taking if there's a whole bunch of plants of the same species and you're kind of documenting this population, then you'd want to do a polygon. So you'd click polygon, and then you can do freeform and draw it like it's on the left, or you can hit vertices and it will draw a square, or kind of a square or rectangle. And so it kind of whatever works for you. What I like about this new feature, being able to draw a polygon, is that it automatically then knows what the area is. So I have a really hard time estimating area if I'm looking at a population of plants and I want to say, oh, it's about, how big that area is. But if I can draw it on a map, then this bottom part where it says infestation size, it will automatically calculate it. If you're estimating, that's totally fine. You can just kind of roughly estimate the square feet or acres. But if you're drawing the polygon, it calculates that for you. And then you can estimate density. So within that 1.13 acres in this example, how dense of the species that you're talking about are in there. One other thing to note, so this on the left, it says infestation status. It automatically puts positive because you're here and you're documenting it, so it's a positive report. The other things that it will show as options are treated or negative. And I think the treated part is another really interesting part, and why EdMaps in particular is very good for invasive species documentation. Because treated means that, like, there's a kudzu, in this example, a kudzu plant here, but we're gonna either remove it or spray it with herbicide or something, so we're treating it. It gives it, so it makes this tool a tool for managers to go back to the same population and monitor its success or the success of treatment. So you can go the first time and say it's positive. You can go a week later and treat it, and you can record the treatment. And then you can come back again and again and record the treatment, and then you can come back and have a negative. So a negative means that this was present at some point in time, but it's surveying again to show that it's not there anymore. And so that's a really unique feature of an invasive species specific database, because you're treating something. And then in addition to, the last thing I showed that later, sorry. Other things you can do within the app, you can have a species list. So I do that for the species list. For species that I'm regularly, for species that I'm regularly recording, I'll add that to my species list. So for example, at the Linda Laurie Nature Foundation, one of the species we document a lot is Japanese black pine. So on my custom species list, I have Japanese black pine right at the top, as well as Scotch broom, miscanthus, which is the Chinese silvergrass I'll mention in a minute, and a few others that I regularly record about. So then they're right up there on my species list. The queue are things that you have documented but haven't uploaded yet. So it's important to upload the data when you maybe get back to the office or get back to your home. And then this is where you can also change your state. So remember, I mentioned if you're downloading the state field guide, you can change states at any time. So there's just, in addition to the desktop, there's just a lot of tools available on the app as well. And so we already talked about this, the different species information that's available. And so if you're not sure what you have and you think you might have an idea, and you can look up some species information. So you can go to the species information page. You can look at details of the plant, just like a regular field guide. You can look at a whole bunch of images. There's also maps for distribution. So you can say, well, I think it's this plant, but I'm not sure. Where does this plant normally exist? And you can go to the map. So there's a lot of resources available. And if you're on this page, for example, and then you think, oh yeah, I do have this plant, and the top right, you can hit report, and it will take you right to that page for reporting. So there's a lot of functionality. It might seem confusing now, but there's just a lot of different ways to use the tool. The other thing I was going to mention was, the identifying characteristics. So this is just more of the kind of information page. So if you're looking at images and then you're looking at the distribution, when you look at the distribution, it'll show you, it's not just it shows you actually points of where the plants occur in your area based on where you are. So this is an example that I took directly from the EdMaps website. So this is from the University of Georgia. So you can see the blue dot is where the person is standing, And then these are all the individual mimosa trees that are around them. So they kind of know, okay, if there's this many around me, then I must have identified this one correctly. And then this little icon that says upload queue, that's where after you've been in the field and you've like recorded all these points, at the very end of your time is when you upload the queue. So sometimes it's best to do that when you have Wi-Fi. So if you're out and about in the field and you're collecting all these points, and for me, I come back into the office and then I upload the queue when there's a lot of, when I have more Wi-Fi. It's just that kind of, it goes faster that way and is a lot easier. So the next thing I want to talk about besides how we collect the data is how the data can be served. So the other things that you can do with EdMap's data and looking at, you know, the data that are available in our area. So this next series of slides are based on the EdMap's website. So what you're able to kind of get out of EdMap's. So you can see one of the things I use a lot are this distribution maps section. It's a way to see the data within EdMap's. So the first thing you do when you get to distribution maps is not a map at all, but a list of all the species. And so if you know what species you want, you can type it easily, or you can narrow it to the plants, insects, diseases, and wildlife. See, look at that big snake. Thank goodness we don't have to worry about those on Nantucket. So let's say we're interested in Canada thistles. You can see the name, the common name. You can see the scientific name. You can see how many records there are within EdMap's. And then it gives you a choice to view it by state, by county, by point, and as a list. So if you look by state, it'll just color the states. But you can look by county and you'll get a picture of the whole country, and you'll see all the counties shaded in where the species is present. But you don't really have an idea of this, looking at this, of how dense it is. It could be one plant for the whole state or for the whole county, and it'll still be colored in. If you look at literature versus observation, I find this one very interesting because it tempers the quality of the data or the type of data. So a yellow square is literature only, which means there's some list somewhere, some flora that was published that says the species is present, but there's not actually observational data that goes with it. So if there's observational data only, it's blue. If there's literature only, it's yellow. And then if there's both, which is a pretty solid documentation, it's green. And this example was once again Canada thistle. But what I often look at most closely are the point data. So if I say I want to look at points, and I'm looking at something like Japanese honeysuckle, Linacea japonica for the whole country, you get these dots, and the further out you go, it smooshes all the points together, so it's an amalgamation of all the points. So that's why like one big point says like 108 or 10,812 individuals, but as you get closer, those points kind of spread out. But what I want you to notice from here are the different colors. So remember when we were talking about collecting data, there's positive data, there's negative data, there's treated data, and there's eradicated data. So those are the different categories, and they come up in those different colors. And we'll see some local examples of that as well. So this is not a local example, but just what you're able to see when you get closer up. So this is that Canada thistle example again, but this is like looking up at like, you know, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and as you get closer, those points spread out. And then if you click on any one dot or record, you can see the record of information, pictures of the species, and exactly where that is, if it's exact location information is available. So now let's look at some local stuff. So I just got this today, so this is the most up-to-date data, and the maps might look a little different because EdMap's did update their website recently. So this is looking at all of the invasives that have been recorded for Nantucket. So this is all the different species. And so there's about, let's say there's a 766 positive and 30 treated, but there's actually like 1,200 records that are in this area. So some of them are from literature, and so they don't have exact location information. But what I find interesting is here's where you can see some of the treated individuals that are yellow. There's some examples I'll show in a little bit that are closer up where you can see treated individuals. You can see there's a lot in town, there's 125, but obviously you'd have to zoom in closer to see what the spread is of those. You can see there's 75 over where I am right now at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, and that's because we made a concerted effort to document a lot of species there. They're not all in that exact one spot, but just because we're spread out. And so what I thought I would do now is just show you a few of our invasive species that we work on, some species that we want more information on that I would encourage people to collect data on. If people are interested in learning more or collecting data for us through EdMaps, if you don't have your own interests in mapping, reach out to me and I'm happy to point you in a few directions for certain species. So one of the species that we know is prevalent on Nantucket and we work on a lot to remove is spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed is called spotted knapweed. If you look close at this picture of the blossom, the bracts at the base of the flower head have black tips. So when you kind of stand back a little bit, it looks spotted, like it's got black polka dots on it. It has a thistle-like flower, but it's not a spiky plant. It grows tall in like June and July. We'll see it a lot, road edges specifically. And then when it's not flowering, there's this basal rosette, as we see on the lower left picture. Why it's a problem is because it invades grasslands in particular, and this species has caused millions, if not billions of dollars in economic harm in the western states where it's invaded rangelands and different grasslands. And because we prize our coastal grasslands here on Nantucket, we're really concerned about this species getting into some of our pristine grasslands. So the invasive plant species committee for Nantucket, which I mentioned before, this is one of the species we actively manage together as a group. So the map that's on here is our EdMaps map for Nantucket, and these are the occurrences that have been recorded for spotted knapweed. Now it might look like a lot because there's a number, they're kind of spread throughout the island, but I know because I've worked with the species, I know that this does not reflect the sheer number of species. Since, for the past like eight years, I've been a part of removing the species every year from different parts of the island. We haven't maybe documented it as well as we should have. So this is an example of a species we know is highly invasive on Nantucket, very prevalent, but we don't have that data to show. So like when I started this talk and I was talking about having the data to kind of prove that we've had this problem, we really need the documentation. So that's something that we're making a concerted effort for this year, is to take more EdMaps records. So we know that, Eel Point Road, Dionis, right now it says there's three, but I think we pull like tens, if not 100 every year. So it's not really reflecting what we see on the landscape. We work really hard in the Cisco area and parts of Nantucket, along the bike paths, smooth hummocks area. There's like a lot of different areas where we have actively managed for the species. Another species that's becoming more and more prevalent on the landscape that I think would be good to document is black swallowwort. Black swallowwort is one that we don't actively pull by hand because it actually is one that I actually do recommend chemical intervention. It's sometimes called dog strangle vine, which is a horrible thing. But you can see from this middle picture, the vines that twist and twist and twist together, they just grow on top of and over everything. It has a milkweed-like seed pod, and it has a milky sap. So sometimes monarch caterpillars will try to feed on it and it's toxic to them. The EdMaps map also doesn't reflect where we know the species to be occurring. this little triangle, this rectangle on the eastern side of the island reflects, it's supposed to be right around Bank Street. I kind of stuck it on there. Bank Street was where the species was first discovered in the early 2000s. And because it was on private property, even though many of us had seen it and knew it was there, it was on private property and we weren't allowed to manage for it. Since then, it has spread in many different areas, and it's now quite common at the corner of Eel Point Road and Nantucket Road, and then all down Nantucket Road. And we're, kind of finding it a lot on the western side. So this is a species that if you do find it, definitely let us know, but also probably remove it if you find it at your own home. Oh, there, that's the Bank Street location. And just like, I mentioned before, if you click on any of the individual dots, you can get some of the record information for this individual. So this particular individual was reported by Emily Molden, who's the executive director of the Land Council. She reported this in June of 2015, looks like on Milestone Road. And one of the others, I'm not going to go over too many individual species, but it was just highlighting some of the ones we'd love for more information on. So Chinese silvergrass Miscanthus sinensis is a species we'd really like more information on and more documentation. So you can see this one actually has more documentation than the black swallowwort, but this one isn't currently listed as invasive in the state. Because we need more data to kind of prove invasiveness. This is a really popular landscape plant. So the kind of goal with collecting more data is to be able to show that it is invasive so that we can kind of eliminate it from the horticultural trade if possible. This example on the top left is what I see very commonly. It grows on the road edges in the sandy soil. So it's great in the sandy soil. But it's right on the edge of our native grassland habitat. It spreads very easily, and it's a very popular landscape plant, especially along driveways. It's up and down Eel Point Road now. It's something that I manage every year. So that's why there's 17 location and spots down on the western end where I am, because we've been working really hard to document all the individuals that we're finding on our properties. And you can see in areas like Land Bank land and Conservation Foundation property, they're kind of yellow and red because they're showing the yellows are the ones that have been managed and the reds are present on the landscape still. And I think the last example I have here is an aquatic invasive. We actually we're fortunate on Nantucket compared to our, the mainland, where we don't have too many freshwater aquatic invasives clogging our waterways that they do in other areas. Parrot feather is one of our exceptions. So this was found in, I think, 2017 or 2018 in a small water body that's connected to my Comet Pond. So there was a lot of interest in eradicating this population pretty quickly because we didn't want to get into the full my Comet Pond. It's a common aquarium plant. What happens is people dump out their aquariums and then may infiltrate a waterway and choke it out. So the land bank is currently managing this population and with a lot of success. You can see the buoys in this picture kind of documenting the edge of the infestation. So they've had a lot of success in managing this population, but this is one I would want people to keep an eye out for. So if you do see something like this, this is the above ground parrot feather piece, and this is what it looks like in the pond. This would be a good one to document to alert people to its presence. And so while I've been talking all this time about EDDMap's particular, because it is our chosen invasive species database, if you heard my talk a few months ago about INaturalist is another biodiversity database for collecting information on species. And so yes, INaturalist is also good for documenting invasive species. However, if you're interested in certain species because that's something that you care about, I would still encourage you to go through EDDMap's. However, if you're already someone who uses iNaturalist, that we recognize that our state, Massachusetts, has just started recognizing iNaturalist as a source for reputable records. So they do need to be research grade. So that means that it has to be verified by more than 2 other people on iNaturalist. And then it's not the same as it doesn't have the same early detection and rapid response framework that EdMaps does. So if you remember, EdMaps, when you submit a record, every single record gets submitted to a team of local verifiers. So no matter what, I will get an alert that that somebody saw something, whether it's garlic mustard or parrot feather or the black swallowwort or something that we know it's very common, like Japanese knotweed. And the benefit of that is that if something like parrot feather is seen, I definitely want to know that right away, because we want to know if it's invaded a new water body. So it's an immediate alert. And that's where that early detection piece comes in, so that if we need to respond, then we can respond quickly. For iNaturalist, we don't get alerts like that. You can kind of keep an eye on it, but you don't always get alerts when new species are found. Although the benefit of iNaturalist is that it's very easy to use, and many more people use iNaturalist now than ever have before. I just wanted to show these 2 individual species for Nantucket. So purple loosestrife is one of our invasive species that invades riparian areas and waterways. And you can see there's, I actually don't know the total number of records. I think between 6 and 10 records from 2016 up to 2021. There's some older ones as well. And these are all research grades that we're seeing. We know there's many more individuals of loosestrife, but these are probably incidentally seen. People are walking around, have their iNaturalist, and can record these data. The one on the right-hand side is garlic mustard. There's only a handful of records for garlic mustard on this map, and garlic mustard is found throughout the island in lots of different places. So it's just an additional data set. So when we recently, a few of us recently proposed some new invasives to the state, we had to, gather our evidence, and that included data from both EdMaps and iNaturalist. And so it is another excellent data source as well. So just to follow up and to end on thinking about invasive species generally on Nantucket, what can you do? So obviously I've talked a lot about databases and collecting the data and sharing the data through EdMaps or iNaturalist, but there's lots of other things you can do as an individual as well. So my first thing is to say manage your yard. And that doesn't mean you have to cut down everything, but just think about your own yardscape and what you're planting, plant native where possible, but also remove the non-native invasives. I also have non-natives in my yard, but I don't have any that we know to be invasive. So I think that's important to think about at your scale. Also, proper disposal. So many non-native species cannot go into the compost because some of the nature of what makes them invasive also makes them really good at spreading within the compost. And so I have one more slide after this one about proper disposal. Responsible landscape practices, planting natives is one of the best. Reporting invasive plants, as we've been talking about today, and then also joining pulling events. So we're going to be having some different events this season through the Nantucket Invasive Plant Species Committee, where you can join in, meet other people who are also interested in invasive plants, and join a pulling event. And finally, in terms of disposal, we do have a dumpster at the landfill. So when you go to the dump and you bring your trash and your recycling and your take it or leave it items, there's also an invasive plant disposal dumpster. The dumpster is meant to provide a spot for homeowners in small landscape level to dispose of non-native invasive species so that they do go into the digester, so that we know that that gets hot enough to kill the reproductive material. So keep an eye out for that. And then with that, I just want to thank you for being here. If you are watching this recording later and you have any questions, please feel free to email me at stboyce@llnf.org. One last thing I wanted to mention is that the second week of June, so June 6th to the 13th, we are having the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative is having our Science Showcase Week. And there's multiple events that are associated with that week that are all free and open to the public. And our Invasive Plant Species Committee is going to be having a garlic mustard pull and invasive chat on Thursday morning. So I didn't put it on here, unfortunately, but it will be on the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative website, which is nantucketbiodiversity.org. And with that, I want to thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Excellent.